Welcome to the Impactus podcast. Kirk Giles here with Mauricio Rosa. We are on episode number 6, where we are seeking to equip you as a man for a life of purpose and godly impact. Mauricio, it is always good to see you, my friend.
Good to see you, Kirk. Good to see you. Yes.
We are inching our way closer to the end of 2020, and
Believe it or not.
I'm actually pretty convinced that New Year's this year might be the biggest party that we've ever seen. Like, there might be more people than in all of history who just want a year to be over.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Like there is a light at the end of the tunnel. So for sure, like.
Yeah, and then the tunnel starts all over again on January 1st. But we won't go there. We'll just focus on the positive and say
exactly.
There's a light at the end of the tunnel for sure. But it has been a challenging year, 2020, for a lot of people, hasn't it?
Absolutely, Kirk. It sure has been a very challenging year. And I know that for you, it has also been a very challenging year. And the topic we're going to talk about today, and grieving and lamenting and all this, I know that has had a huge role in your life this year. Why don't you talk a little bit about that, Kirk?
Yeah, so as Mauricio just said, we're going to talk about this gift that God's given to us as people called the gift of lament. And we're going to dive into this. But honestly, it's probably a word that most of our listeners aren't even all that familiar with. Other than knowing that there's a book of the Bible called Lamentations, but most of us kind of skip over that in our devotions. And certainly most guys aren't great at lamenting or expressing what it is they're experiencing emotionally. And we see that because the mental health cases for men in this past year have just exponentially gone higher. My heart is broken as I've read so many stories of some of the challenges men have been facing. There was a story on CBC News recently about this rapid growth in suicide rates in Medicine Hat. And suicide rates amongst young men in their 30s, like guys with families, and just heartbreaking, gut-wrenching stuff to go through. And so while my problems have not been anywhere near some of the challenges that some of you have been facing, this year has been a year where I've had to process a lot of loss in my life. It's not been the easiest of years. My mother-in-law passed away on Christmas Eve back at the end of 2019. And so we had to process that loss. A month before that, my wife had a very, very serious case of just being dizzy and sick, and just she was in bad shape for quite a period of time, and there was just even that sense of loss for her, processing her mother's loss and everything. So that became difficult for us. And then, for me personally, on top of the issues at home, is just also the loss of changing jobs. And that might sound weird for some of you. Some of you are maybe excited to change a job. But for me, there's just a sense of loss because this has been pretty much my adult life has been in this ministry. And I've built relationships with so many people, staff that I work with every day, to supporters of the ministry who volunteer or donate or who pray for us, and beyond. So many ripples and layers of relationships. And it really hit me this year just how much I'm losing in terms of those relationships and not being able to be with and around those people all the time. And as excited as I am for my new calling and new chapter that God's leading me to, there's still a sense of grieving and still a sense of loss in my life. And I came across a book. I was on vacation this summer and really deeply feeling this sense of loss. And I came across a book called Dark Clouds, Deep Mercy, Discovering the Grace of Lament. And I read through this book, and God used it in a powerful way in my own life as I took some time during my summer vacation to just go through a journey of lamenting loss, lamenting the what could have been, what should have been kind of experiences, and understanding that God's actually okay with that. That God's not only okay with it, but He's actually created a way for us to process those emotions and to process them with Him and on Him and even towards Him in many cases. And so it was something that was an incredible healing journey for my own heart, to bring me to a place of addressing the emotions, but also reestablishing, rebuilding my confidence in God and who God is, and replacing that sense of loss with a renewed sense of hope. And I'm so grateful to the Lord for His mercy to us, that He knows us as people enough to know that we need these kinds of things in our life. And so today we're going to be interviewing the author of this book, Mark Vroegop. And Mark is not a household name. He's not a guy that many of you will have ever heard of before. But man, has God ever used him in a powerful way through this book. And I want us to go to the interview now and just listen, be encouraged. If you are facing a season of life where you are feeling loss or discouragement or helpless or hopeless, lament is a gift for you. And this interview will help you. And if you know other men who are experiencing these kinds of emotions in 2020, share this podcast with them. Let them be equipped and encouraged by this. I know that this is going to help men who don't do well at processing their emotions and sharing their emotions, but it will help you to understand that God is with you and God is for you in the midst of these difficult times you're facing. So let's go to this interview now with Mark Vroegop, talking about this gift of lament. Well, Mark, I want to welcome you to the podcast. It is great to have you on with us today.
Kirk, thanks for having me. Appreciate your interest in the book.
Well, I was telling you off air, this book had a profound impact on my own life. And so I know that there's a lot of people who could really benefit from this teaching, because it's not a common teaching in the Christian community, certainly, but it's such an important part of what the scriptures have to say to us. So the word that we're going to focus on is this word lament. And there's certainly a lot of people who are going through all kinds of different experiences right now, a lot of men experiencing different things. But the word lament is not something that, like I said, is part of our vocabulary, certainly not in Canada, and I don't believe in the States. So what is lament? If you had to just kind of summarize it, what does that even mean?
Yeah, in the book, I define lament as a prayer in pain that leads to trust. So each of those sections or those words are really important. So first and foremost, it's a biblical prayer language that God has given us, and we find it throughout the Bible, especially the Psalms. It's a prayer, so it's a way in which I'm talking to God. It's a prayer in pain, so it's a unique kind of prayer that surfaces when we are experiencing the brokenness of a world marred by sin. It's a prayer in pain that leads, so it's meant to be a directionally oriented prayer. So it's not meant to be something that leaves you where you are, but it's supposed to be process language. So lament is more of a journey than it is a destination, and it leads to trust. So at the end of the day, laments are designed to help us to be reminded of what we believe, what our theology is, and to remind us what we know is true. But pain tends to either tempt us to forget it, or because of sort of the eclipsing reality of how much we're struggling, we tend to not live in the promises that are actually true. And so lament kind of, it moves us along in our pain as a way of praying and talking to God.
Yeah, and I think, we live in this really weird space, because I think we sometimes think God's either distant from our pain, or we kind of sugarcoat it with good Christianese language. But there's really this sense that you really uncover and unpack in the book that God's really, he not only knows our pain, but he's okay with us actually expressing our pain too. And that I think is one of the most liberating things for a lot of people. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later, but this comes out of your own journey as well. This comes out of personal, this isn't just a theological thing for you. This is a reality of what you've experienced in your own life. So there was an event that caused you to see the need for lament. Talk about that event in your life.
Yeah, I mean, all lamenters have a story, right? You've got a story, I've got a story. Everyone listening or watching this podcast has a story of their interaction with pain. And we live in a broken world. And in our life, we had lots of different pains. But in 2004, my wife had a stillborn baby girl. Her name was Sylvia. Full-term stillbirth after having multiple no-problem pregnancies. And that set us onto a journey, not only dealing with that loss, but multiple miscarriages, trying to figure out how do we deal with the pain that's in our soul. And at the time, even though I had a seminary education, pastoring a church, the category of lament was unfamiliar to me. And so in the process of just kind of walking through our grief, began talking to God, and then kind of discovered what this was later on in the journey. And looking back, realizing, wow, this is actually what was happening in our lives. And that sort of discovery of the grace of lament, and then trying to pastor people and help them understand how the Bible gives them a language where they can talk to God in the midst of their pain. And quite frankly, if I had known what I know now about lament back in 2004, it would have been helpful in a really significant way. And so what I'm trying to do is help people get ahead of their journey a little bit. Although most people, when I talk with them, very few people study lament just to study it. Instead, what happens is the book or the subject of lament lands on people. And the one thing that I've heard more than anything else is, oh my goodness, you've just explained the last 2 years or 5 years of my life. Right. And so lament is common because the world is broken. And this language helps us to know what it is that we're doing, and then to maybe even use it as a means of grace, because God's given it to us as a way to talk to him.
Yeah, and that, to me, is that phrase, a means of grace, I think has become really something that's captured my attention as I thought about this. Because you also identify this idea that lament is a path to praise. And those two words don't seem to go naturally in the same sentence. It's easy to lament and to mourn and to grieve. I shouldn't say easy, but it's easy to understand what we mean by mourning and grieving and lamenting. But as a pathway to praise, what do you mean by that?
Every lament has a resolution of some kind. Although there's one lament in the Bible, it's a little bit of a mystery, Psalm 88. It kind of leaves it hanging. Some think that Psalm 89 is the second part of Psalm 88. And this prayer language is designed to both be really honest with how hard life is, and at the same time giving us hope by connecting us to the very character of God and the promises in the Bible. And so lament as a prayer language is designed to be able to be really honest and yet robustly theological. It's meant to keep us out of two ditches. On the one hand is the ditch of denial, which I think a lot of Christians, a lot of men in particular, live in, which is, hey, everything's fine, or they even put spiritual language on it, like, praise the Lord, or just trusting in God's goodness. We're behind the veil. There's a deeper level of angst. And then the other ditch is the ditch of despair, where people are like, if I feel this way, I might not even be a Christian. Or in the context of a church, sometimes we convince people that to really grieve this way isn't inherently Christian. And yet, a third of the Psalms are laments. And whether it's a personal lament or a corporate lament or something that's wrestling with injustice, think of this, 1 out of every 3 songs in the official songbook of God's people were in the minor key. And so those songs are meant to be a heartfelt expression of grief that then cause us to be reminded of the truths that pain tends to make us forget. And that's what grieving people need. We need to know, what's the floor? Where is this ever going to end? And of course, we know as Christians that the story of the Bible is it does end: creation, fall, redemption, restoration. And what lament does is it allows us to connect in the in-between time, in sort of these micro moments where I reclaim what I know is true, but pain tends to cloud it. And that's why even the title of the book is Dark Clouds, Deep Mercy. So two things happen at the same time. Dark clouds have come over my life, but in the midst of this, there's mercy and grace available to me from God.
So someone's listening to the podcast right now and they go, okay, this sounds good. What am I supposed to do? Like, what does lament actually look like in terms of a process?
Yeah. Well, one thing you could do immediately is just look at Psalm 13 as a very condensed version of lament, one of the shorter laments in the Bible. And you could kind of see it there. And most laments have 4 key elements in them. Now, it's poetry, it's music, so we have to be careful. It's not like an X plus Y equals Z formula. But in general, lament involves turning to God, laying out our complaints, asking him boldly, and then choosing to trust. Or to put it really simply, turn, complain, ask, and trust. So we could think of that model, turn, complain, ask, and trust, in the same way that we would think of maybe other prayer forms like, acts, adore, confess, thanksgiving, supplication. And I think just having this language of lament as a way to pray can be a really helpful resource that you can use and employ when you're in the middle of grief, because grief feels like it's absolutely out of control. And by using kind of this turn, complain, ask, and trust framework, it actually provides like some tracks. You can kind of push your grief along so that there's a destination connected to it. So each of those elements are important. Turn, in the midst of my grief, I talk to God. I refuse to give him the silent treatment. I complain. I lay out what's wrong. I tell God what I'm wrestling with. Ask, I reclaim the promises of God's word, and trust, I end with a perspective of God, I can trust you. And sometimes I'm praying that and I'm saying that even when I might not believe it. Like the man, I believe, Lord, help my unbelief. And so, Lord, I'm ending this prayer time believing that you're trustworthy, but like the book of Lamentations, it just kind of ends with hope, but hope with a pretty big question mark. Like, this isn't going to happen forever, right, Lord? So I'm trusting you, but like, this is hard. And I think, honestly, that's where most Christians really live, if we're really honest. There's not many clear, buttoned up summaries to, this is what's going on. We live in this gap between promise made and promise fulfilled, and lament is the language for that journey.
I think that's so important. And you kind of alluded to this earlier about how the Psalms, because it's poetry, it's not kind of an X plus Y equals Z kind of thing. And I think for a lot of Western Christians, we've kind of lived in a bit of a formula Christianity. If you do A plus B plus C, God will give you D kind of thing. And what lament is really reminding us is, no, we do live in this kind of broken world. And things aren't the way that they're supposed to be. And even if you do A plus B plus C, you might not get D right away. Like, you might not get that end result. And how do you process that when it doesn't happen? So lament is such a, I know for me, I have found it to be a powerfully important way of dealing with those things. Now, I think most people would agree with all the high points that you described of what lament looks like, the process of it, except for one word, which would cause a few people to stumble, and that's the word complaining. What do you say to somebody who says complaining to God does not really sound biblical or very godly to me?
Yeah. Well, the first thing I would say is I understand that. And you could sinfully complain. So I don't want to say you just have now permission to tell God all of your wicked claims as to why he's been unfair to you. I've known a lot of grieving people, myself included, who in their grief, they didn't turn to God, they turned to sin. And their grief became a cul-de-sac for their sorrow. And it became their identity, and it became this thing that created bitterness within them. So that's not what lament is designed to do. What a complaint is just candidly acknowledging the reality of the moment. And my challenge is that I found that more Christians, either, again, two sort of extremes, either they sinfully complain or they're just not honest. And I think the Bible, with lament Psalms, says things like, How long, O Lord, will you forget me forever? Or Psalm 77, has the steadfast love of the Lord ceased? Has he forgotten to be gracious? Has his love come to an end? I mean, if we're in a small group and some brother's praying that, we might be like, man, the pastor needs to talk to that guy because he's got bad theology. Well, he just prayed the Psalms, right? And so I think part of it is we're unfamiliar with the contours of grief and we want quick solutions. And so we're not familiar with what it means to enter into people's pain and allow them to be honest with the reality of their struggle. And I'm just telling you from my own walk and in counseling and helping with people, it's amazing how therapeutic and helpful and sort of head clearing and soul refreshing it is for someone to be able to say, God, this is really hard. And I am really struggling with what's going on here. And then using that as a platform to then move on and move towards the reclaiming of those promises. So, the one critique that I've heard from a fair number of people about the concept of lament is, well, doesn't the Bible say we're to rejoice always? And yes, it does. I'm not saying you shouldn't rejoice. My question is, how do you get there? And I think that many people think that rejoicing and complaining are absolutely antithetical and they don't go together. But I think in the Bible, they're actually more closely aligned than what we realize. Can you really rejoice if you haven't really wrestled with how broken the world is? And if you wrestle with how broken the world is, it makes your rejoicing actually even more theologically informed and even more God-honoring, I think, because you've really taken a faith step and said, this is really bad, but God is really good. And those two things, like those two realities, I think is what the Christian life is all about. Life is broken, but Jesus reigns.
Yeah,
I'm a sinner, but Jesus has rescued me. So I think those parallel truths are really vital to what it means to be a follower of Jesus. And grief just happens to surface the need to understand that reality a little more poignantly.
It's interesting because when I read the book, at the same time I was reading the book, in my own personal devotions, I was spending a fair bit of time in some of the different prophets in the Old Testament. And you read some of the prophets in the Old Testament and you get this picture of a God who is sovereign and reigns over everything. And for me, it was so incredibly helpful to kind of have this counterbalance between lamenting and grieving and being honest with God and complaining to God, but then kind of counterbalancing it with the truth of what God's word says about God reigns over all. He knows it all. He rules over it all. He's going to make it all okay in the end. That just really helped me learn to trust God more. And I think that's what lament really does, right? It doesn't just leave us in a space of complaining. It grows us into trusting God more.
Right. Yeah. And if you think about it, most people would say, and I'm sure, Kirk, this is true in your life, it's true in mine, that the intensity of my growth is directly related to the intensity of my pain.
Yeah.
I don't grow super well when I'm on vacation, but I grow really well. I don't like it when I'm in the crucible of hardship and suffering. And so in that respect, lament actually becomes a really helpful language for those moments where we've got to just not theoretically know if we believe that Jesus reigns. Like practically, I've got to be able to believe that Jesus reigns as I'm standing over the grave of a baby who I would love to have in my life. And yeah. I've got to wrestle with, so does the supremacy of Christ apply in the graveyard? And it does, but that's a gutsy application. And I think that's where Christianity is at its best, is in those moments.
Yeah. So we might have some people who are listening who think, I'm not in a spot where I'm going through a tough time at all. But man, I've got a friend, and that friend or that spouse or that whatever, they could really use this right now. What advice do you have for somebody who's kind of walking alongside somebody else who's hurting or struggling in their life right now?
Yeah. Years ago, I heard John Piper say that the time to teach your people how to suffer is before they suffer. And I think it's always good to be studying lament, especially if you can study it before you're in the crucible of suffering, so that you'll know how to apply it in your own life, but also how to be able to apply it in the lives of others. And so if somebody isn't suffering, and even if they don't know that someone is suffering, I think doing a study on lament would be incredibly helpful, because when the time comes to help a friend, having this category will help you do two things. Number one, it'll help you to not panic when your friend laments. Instead of just freaking out like, oh my goodness, they're losing their mind, you can just know, no. They're just lamenting. Like don't panic. They're in the process of grieving. And that's really helpful, because the second thing that it also means that you can do is to know how to counsel them and how to apply the gospel, how to apply the Bible to their lives, which when someone's grieving takes unusual skill and wisdom. When you're walking through hardship and difficulty, everybody has these stories of well-meaning Christians who just said silly, stupid, unhelpful things. And, less is more for sure. And if you've got a friend who's walking through grief, this would be a moment for you to know how to be able to pray with them, to encourage them. This is not the time to instruct them about their sorrow or to instruct them about lament. That time may come, but first we need to sympathize with the person so that we have the audience to be able to provide instruction and counsel in the future. So I don't generally recommend that you jump in and, hey, I found this great book on lament, and, in the early stages of grief and sorrow. I think the best thing for us to do is to be there to express your solidarity with them. There may be a point in time, or if you give them a book like Dark Clouds, Deep Mercy, it could be something that includes a note that just says at some point in time, probably not right now, but I think this book might be helpful to you when you're ready. So I think just understanding that, because grief is so complex. I say in the book that grief is not tame. And so it requires an unusual skill level in navigating that. So study lament now so you can be wise in how you help a friend, even in the immediate time frame.
Yeah, that's good. One final question in the time that we have left. As you've gone through this many times over, helped other people to process and go through lament, what's the biggest lesson that you've personally learned just from learning how to lament in your life?
I think that there are layers to lament. Just when you think you've understood it, there's a new application, and there's a new way for it to be applied. And it's one thing like, lamenting about one particular topic is hard, but then there's other stuff like, even this morning, I'm just praying through some things, and I'm reminding myself, don't give God the silent treatment. Don't give God the silent treatment, because there's things that I'm exhausted with, and I don't even have the energy to pray about them. And yet it's important to continue to talk to God about those things. And, it takes faith to lament. And when I wrote that, I knew that was true, but it's true in different spaces in different ways because of the differing levels of pain or exhaustion, or even just the sense of hopelessness that can come. Lamentations 3, New Living Translation says, I will never forget this awful time, but even still, I will dare to hope. One of the scariest things to do is to start to dare to hope that life could be different. And I think lament is a helpful language through that journey, but man, there's layers to it. And even after writing about it, doing a lot of talking and teaching on it, I still find myself trying to figure out how to do it well and how to do it in different ways, in different seasons, and on different topics.
Yeah, that's good, which is a great way of reminding us that this isn't just a formula. This is part of our living relationship with God, and it just continues to develop and grow in us as we keep practicing it and going through different circumstances in our lives. So it's good. Mark, I want to say thank you for this gift that you've given to everyone who's going to read it, and to the Christian community, just to bring us back to what the scriptures say on this important topic. I just deeply appreciate you and putting your own story out there like this, as well as your journey and what God's been teaching you about lament. I believe that every man can benefit for themselves, for their family, for their church community, by learning to lament well. And so thank you for giving this gift to the body of Christ.
Well, Kirk, thanks for your interest and for not just talking about it, but walking through this personally. And hope that many people, many men especially, will discover this beautiful language that with so much grace embedded in it, that being lament.
Well, Kirk, I again like this interview. I really enjoyed the conversation. How real, how honest it was. Listening Mark's story, and also I think like for me, there are a couple of things that he pointed out that I think we need to constantly be reminded. I really like the way that he placed lament, the use of the language of lament in between the promises that God has given us. And the promises that have not been fulfilled yet. So lament is kind of the bridge between the two, and so that's such a powerful concept for us to understand. And how he talks about, like 30% of the Psalms are lament. That's a huge thing that we often just skim through. We don't realize on the language and how God accounted for that for us. That was really powerful.
Yeah, it sure was. I loved his vulnerability and his honesty in this. And, in this time of mental health, where so many people are talking about mental health, I just think that this is one of God's great gifts to us. Like,
yes.
We go to so many other places for solutions to our mental health, and maybe we don't go anywhere for solutions to our mental health. Maybe we try to just fix it ourselves. But men, if you're listening to this and you're battling discouragement and you're battling loss, oh my goodness, this is such a gift from God, and His Spirit just enters into these prayers in personal, powerful, real ways. I cannot encourage you enough to access these kinds of things in your life. And Marcio, don't you think that that in some ways it would also be good for guys to be able to actually almost work through this together with other guys?
Oh, absolutely, Kirk. I have no doubt about it. And even Mark, he mentioned that on the interview in the conversation, right? That he talks about that guys often default to two reactions. One is to just go, oh no, everything is good, everything is fine, but they're not really being honest with how they are really feeling. And the other one is to just kind of a give up kind of a thing. And the way that I think this works is, as you were pointing, like us doing this together. So when you have people that you can openly and honestly talk about it and tell where you are, knowing that you're not going to be judged, knowing that you're not necessarily complaining. I think this was another thing that he talks about, that lamenting is not necessarily complaining. It's just acknowledging the reality that you're living in and bringing that before God. And there is no better way to do that than being with somebody else. And he mentions that on the interview, the value and importance of, for you that are not going through this season, to be this friend to someone who is going through this season, how valuable and important that is.
Absolutely. And as we enter into the Christmas season, I want to challenge you as men to recognize that whether it's you or I can guarantee you there are people around you who need this. You don't have to look very far to see people who are struggling these days, people who are feeling overwhelmed, people who feel a sense of hopelessness and being lost and confused. Just so many things going on all around us in our personal lives and in the world around us today. There are days where you kind of feel like you're hanging on just by the last string, so to speak, and hoping something changes. So I really want to encourage you guys. And as a ministry, I know we've got small groups for men. We've got workshops online that you can check out. These are places and areas where you can connect with other men if you need other men in your life. And so check those out at impactus.org. I know that they will be very helpful for you, as they have been for so many men along the way. I want to just finish, as always, by reading to you from God's Word. I'm going to read a psalm that is a psalm of lament, and I'm just going to read a few verses from it. And I want you just to pay attention to the emotions that are being expressed here, the raw, honest emotions, and then how it finishes with a sense of hope. And you might find yourself in these emotions. So maybe this is your prayer today, but here's what Psalm 44, beginning of verse 23 says, "Wake up, Lord. Why are you sleeping? Get up. Don't reject us forever. Why do you hide and forget our affliction and oppression? For we have sunk down to the dust and our bodies cling to the ground. Rise up and help us, God. Redeem us because of your faithful love."
Thanks for listening to the Impactus podcast. To learn more about living a life of purpose and godly impact, check out impactus.org.